here, he says, and I'm very much looking towards the talk, which is science at the service of secular and religious agendas.
So thank you very much, John, and thank you all of you. And when you organize something, you finally got the coffee breaks and the lunches and the flights, and suddenly you realize, oh gosh, I was giving a paper. So that's the last thing you think of when you organize something. Plus, since you are all here, I said earlier this morning, anyone wanting some bite after Peter Bowler's talk tonight downtown, I just pass this thing and you write down your name so that at the end I can call the restaurant. Anyway, so science and religion at the service of secular and religious agendas. Let me just say at the beginning, it's the first, well, not the first time, but one of the first times I speak publicly about science and religion, because that is trouble, okay? And especially in this country, where, as I understand it, this country is rather religious, but terribly, terribly clerical, and therefore terribly, terribly anti-clerical. And therefore you get in trouble when you talk about these things. So science and religion is a very popular industry in the English-speaking world. And no matter how much historians of science try to write a more nuanced relationship than the one portrayed by John Draper and Andrew Dixon White at the end of the 19th century, one element of the conflict thesis remains, namely the existence of two separate elements, science on the one side and religion on the other, the relationships between which need to be explained. Okay. Similar dichotomies like science and power, science and politics, science and philosophy have been largely written off, at least in the tradition of the social studies of science. Not so, at least not to the same extent, with science and religion, certainly not in the 19th and 20th century. Furthermore, both scholars and charlatans on science and religion tend to focus on the same issues again and again, namely Galileo, evolution, Big Bang, quantum and neurological indeterminacy, and with them on the question of authority, both political and epistemological, and the temporal origins of man and the world and human freedom. Just to mention two recent examples, in his very short introduction to science and religion, Thomas Dixon, many of you know him, argues that the conflicts between religious and scientific ideas are only the visible tips of much larger and deeper lying structures, namely questions such as, and I quote, what are the most authoritative sources of knowledge? What is the most fundamental reality? What kinds of creatures are human beings? What is the proper relationship between church and state? Who should control education? Can either scripture or nature serve as reliable ethical guides? So this is broadening the picture of science and religion. So these philosophical questions, and I use philosophical here in the Socratic idea of let's talk and think about absolutely everything, can only be shown to be conflicts between science and religion if one reifies these two categories as corresponding to essential and mutually exclusive entities. Interestingly, Dixon's book, after this kind of enlarging the picture, ends up talking about the same things, Darwinism, creation, and the whole thing. So I think of that book like Steve Shapin's book on the scientific revolution. There was no such thing as scientific revolution, and this is a book about the scientific revolution. So I think of Thomas Dixon's and also Peter Harrison's edited volume along those lines. So equally, Peter Harrison's edited Cambridge Companion to Science and Religion gives a structure, and not the content of the papers, I must say, in which science and religion remain two distinct entities that conflict with each other in certain territories, mainly, again, creation, Darwin, psychology, and ethics. That is the classical story, and one that interests the general public and also the most influential funding body on this industry of science and religion, namely John Templeton Foundation, of which you may have heard certainly a lot. The latter, the Templeton Foundation, defines itself as, and I think it's somewhere in the website, a philanthropic catalyst for discoveries relating to the big questions of human purpose and ultimate reality. Certainly they are reluctant to historical studies and enemies of relativism, constructivism, and even contingency in scientific knowledge. The Templeton Foundation is, the way I see it, the current example of a scientific tradition of a kind, that is, one that places such trust in science so as to turn it into the warrant of certain religious dogmas and practices. And that's perhaps the underlying thing of my thesis here, right? This faith in science as the rubber stamp for religion is only the specular image of the uses of science to support secularist, anti-religious, or simply anti-clerical agendas in the second half of the 19th century. Around 1830, we find two iconic representatives, one of each strand, the Bridgewater Treatises in England and the Philosophy of Auguste Comte in France. In case I don't manage these two strands of let's use science for religious purposes, the Bridgewater Treatises, let's use science for secular purposes, Auguste Comte, positivism, and all the strand of positivism afterwards. So in case I don't manage to explain what I want to explain, I plan this talk in two separate elements. One is I'm going to tell you the ideas that are in my mind, and somehow I want to put them together, and then I'll go to the case studies, right? So what are the ideas I have in mind? Basically these five, I just put them like here. It's not that one follows the other, it's just 5 ideas that have been in my mind on these science-religion conflicts or relationships or nothingness, right? So the first one is a paper I love, which is Peter Harrison. Peter Harrison was till recently the science and religion professor in Oxford and has gone back to Melbourne. And he has this paper, 206, published 2 or 3 times in different settings, constructing the boundaries, science and religion constructing the boundaries. And there, Peter Harrison makes the following claim. Science and religion is a construction that comes from mainly the second half of the 19th century, when science itself was becoming an entity. That is, when science itself was being professionalized, something that was not happening before. And religion, interestingly, is also a construct that in a way has a story going back to the 17th century and the Reformation and the 30 Years' War and the Protestants and the different denominations and the Catholics and so on, and also in 19th century colonialism. Before the 17th century, you had the Christian, that is the European, and the pagan, and it's not the same. It's not the same category. After the Reformation, you have a number of denominations of Christians, and therefore you can introduce the concept of religion as something that defines these things together. And in the 19th century, with colonialism, British colonialism, French colonialism, and so on, you have all these other things, and you create the category of religion. And in that context, one of the trends is to create the conflict thesis, because if I want science to be important, I need a conflict with other things, ancient, old, or simply the things that are not what I want to do. So that's kind of the first idea in my mind. Second, Eric Hobsbawm's idea of the tradition, the invention of traditions. And he has this, well, I'm sure you all know that, invented tradition. And following Peter Harrison's paper, so the conflict thesis, I see it as one of these invented traditions in order to create an identity, the identity of the scientists, with its heroes, with its history of pain and suffering in order to get where we want to be and so on. So an invented tradition in the science-religion thing. And let me quote from Eric Hobsbawm's introduction to the volume on invented traditions, which I showed Katie. Where are you, Katie? I showed Katie yesterday at her book, and Eric Hobsbawm's invented tradition had the same picture on the cover, which is a bowler hat, right? Anyway, so he says, in his words, invented traditions since the Industrial Revolution seem to belong, and I quote, seem to belong to 3 overlapping types. 1, those establishing or symbolizing social cohesion or the membership of groups, real or artificial communities. That is, the scientists, in my reading. B, those establishing or legitimizing institutions, status, or relations of authority, the science in society. C, those whose main purpose was socialization, the inculcation of beliefs, value systems, and conventions of behavior. And I think these 3 elements of the invented tradition notion of Eric Hobsbawm fits very well into the idea of science and religion as a conflict. The third one is the thesis of the late Frank Turner's in a paper from 1978, I think it is, the Victorian conflict between science and religion, a professional dimension. Together with epistemological conflicts in the 19th century saw the institutionalization and professionalization of science and the related need to fight for prestige in the face of current established, mainly in the academy, where the humanities, theology included, had the upper hand. Turner argues that there had been a long tradition in the 18th and first half of the 19th century of clergymen scientists like Priestley and Sedgwick, William Whewell, but that the increasing naturalization of science in geology, biology, physiological psychology, and so on, paved the way for an attack on religion outlooks on science. As an example, he mentions Francis Galton's 1872 book, English Men of Science, Their Nature and Nurture, where Galton depicted a first sociological study of British scientists with a bias to show that the pursuit of science is uncongenial to the priestly character. So basically, what Galton is saying is, if you're a priest, you cannot be a scientist, right? Galton's tactic was a commonplace one with emerging professional groups, edging out marginal members on the grounds of alleged indifference or incompetence. His real change against the clergyman scientists was that they were first clergymen, scientists second. So even if you're a clergyman and a scientist, that doesn't count. So you create a statistics in which it proves that science and religion are enemies. Turner's thesis, not the thesis, but the thesis on this paper, not his other book, which is, I'll talk about it later, creates this conflict thesis on the professionalization of science outside academia. And I think that thesis needs to be put further on how that conflict thesis that becomes clear in outside academia then moves into the academic realm. In the same way, there was a struggle by scientists, physicists, chemists, and so on to get prestige, so that to get prestige within academia, not social prestige, but prestige within academia. And the case I know better, of course, is the reluctance in Cambridge to create a lab of physics, because this is a university. It's a serious place. It's not a place for factories, right? Factories up in Manchester. Here it's Cambridge, so we don't have labs. And that's not a science-religion thing. That's, if you want, a humanities science, or what's the role of the university at thing. A fourth idea that I have in mind, so it's this kind of brainstorming thing. The fourth topic, which is the idea of a secular redemption, and that's very part of the promises of science. I use redemption very much as science and technology are giving what some religions were promising. And I wonder, and here I'm not specialist on the philosophies of religions, but I wonder whether redemption is a specifically Christian idea and not a general religion idea. But anyway, that's just a question mark. And the last thing, which is, as I said in the beginning, a lot has been said and done and written, and of course we have one of the experts, which is Peter Bowler, on science and religion in Britain in the early 20th century. But what about that conflict thesis outside of Britain? I said science and religion is an industry with a lot of money and a lot of impact in Britain and certainly in the US, and not so much in continental Europe. And as some of you know, there is this group that was set up kind of 15 years ago, Science and Technology in the European Periphery, the STEP group, with people from Spain, from Greece, from Portugal, and so on, studying what can be translated historiographically. And I wonder what kind of peculiarities the conflict thesis has in places where even the idea of original research and science is not clear, right? So that's kind of the, and actually I've decided to start within STEP a section on science and religion in the European periphery to see if there is a historiographical problem there to translate the things that we have in America and in Britain to the rest of at least Europe or more periphery. So, right. So these are kind of the ideas that are there in order to share my paper. How does this fit in the context of promises of science? Let me state that my period of interest is the 19th and early 20th centuries, when, following the mainstream historiography that Harrison uses, not only the conflict thesis was construed, but also science, and to a lesser extent religion. Before that, in the early modern period and during the Enlightenment, natural philosophy had incorporated many religious notions into its rhetoric. Salvation, redemption, truth, ethics were all partly secularized, with method and reason enthroned the goddess reason, enthroned as ultimate authorities. Think of Francis Bacon's frontispiece, think of Was ist Erklärung by Kant, or the Enlightenment idea of reason. This is, as in Charles Taylor's analysis, what constituted a secular age, one in which, in his definition, it is possible not to believe in God, although most people still did. That's Charles Taylor's secular age. The power attributed to methodical and empirical reason in the understanding of nature also transformed the theological power of natural philosophy. Christianity had held that God manifested through the visible, something that medieval Thomism had articulated through the notion of secondary causes and the analogy of being. The new power of natural reason triggered all sorts of elaborate versions of the God of the gaps. The completeness of natural reason in the understanding of nature meant that any gaps in the understanding were signs of the direct divine action. That's the shift between a medieval understanding of what's the action of God through secondary causes and what's the action of God when we have a naturalized reason, which is the action of God comes in as the God of the gaps. So in those things that we cannot apply and that we cannot understand. The Bridgewater treatises on power, wisdom, and the goodness of God as manifested in the creation, these were written from 1833 to 1836, were a last remnant of this tradition. The treatises became the instrument through which the middle classes learned orthodox science and orthodox Christianity, a mixture that the next generation of professional scientists attacked in the second half of the 19th century. This move was a sign that for some, science was becoming the exclusive domain of a new elite that had to cut its ties with previous generations of cultural and educational management, that is, clerical institutions mainly. Neither should the new science be an instrument for theological arguments, nor should the latter influence in any way the development of science. The unbridled and progressive power of reason had to necessarily do away with past dogmatics a prioris, so the rhetoric went. Science was the catchword with which both liberal first and socialist later ideologies identified themselves in their struggle against tradition and conservatism. Science was the promise that society was waiting for. Interestingly, at least to me, many religious and traditional headquarters did not accept that conflict, but presented themselves as science-friendly, or even science promoters. The conflict thesis had at least succeeded in turning science the most important thing to support. So you create a conflict, but the other side doesn't buy the conflict. The other side buys the fact that, oh yes, I'm also a scientist. So to focus my discussion, these are the kind of three case studies I want to mention something about. One is the British case, and I'm sorry if I embarrass myself having real experts on that here. And second, talking about this science and technology in European periphery, I'm going to look at the rhetoric of some papal documents from the Vatican and some issues about Spanish science and religion rhetoric in the late 19th century. So let's start with the first one. Perhaps the X Club and the professionalization of science. Perhaps one of the best studies English lobbies for the promotion of professional liberal science was the X Club, which met from 1864 to 1893, and which was initiated by T.H. Huxley with Tyndall and Spencer, among others. These are people in the club. The Dining Club was formally established as a group of men united in their, quote, devotion to science, pure and free, untrammeled by religious dogmas, end of quote. The X Club was thus putting into practice what people like Comte in France was advocating, a progressive science antagonistic to reactionary metaphysics and religion. As is well known, the professionalization of science in England did not come through the university, it being the last resort to be conquered in this professionalization project, but in professional organizations and institutions like the Royal Institutions, oriented at practical problems rather than philosophical ones. When the myth of a conflict arrived into the academic milieu, it served the purpose of those who wanted to transform the university to a more scientific/research-oriented university rather than the traditional humanities, philosophy, theology one. From my point of view, it was the first stage in what CPs know later would call the two cultures. The quarrel was not so much, as I said, between science and religion in the 19th century universities, but between science and humanities, or if you wish, between different philosophies. There was also a class struggle in these debates. Most members of the X-Club and other professional scientists came from the middle classes and had difficult access into the establishment, a part of which were clerical institutions. I've already mentioned Galton's sociological description of English scientists, what aimed at showing through manipulation of the data that the pursuit of science is uncongenial to the priestly character. But there's a different thing, which is another movement which is compatible to the professionalization of science, which is the famous Oxford movement with John Henry Newman and all these clerics. To say cleric in Oxford or Cambridge in the 1930s is to say Cambridge, right, or Oxford. I mean, most people were clerics anyway. So, and one of the movements that these people had were to purify Anglicanism. So it's high time, they said, that we do what we have to do, which is theology and preaching and doing religious stuff. So the movement of professionalization of science was not just the lobby of the X-Club, but also a movement that found its echo in clerics, in the Oxford movement, certainly, they wanted to define priesthood as distinctly clerical, theological, and devotional terms. For professional scientists, that double vocation seemed retrogressive, but for the high church clergy, it seems progressive and potentially rationalizing. And there's a famous book of John Henry Newman, The Idea of the University, which was used somehow to set up the university in Dublin, what it's now UCD. Let me continue. The conflict thesis promoted by some in order to gain professional and academic positions had its counterpart in people like Henry Sidgwick, Frederick Myers, Alfred Russel Wallace, many of them creators of the Society for Psychical Research that Katie was talking about there earlier. And they were opposed both to Christian orthodoxy, but also to these hyper-materialistic notions that people like Tyndall were using. And the development of the SPR is perhaps the tip of the iceberg of this scientific extra-naturalism in a context in which what was natural and what was not was under scrutiny. In certainly cases of psychology, I think it's one of the best examples that were happening at the time. In his book, not his paper, but his book, Turner argued that the group composed by these people complained about the excessively scientific naturalistic attempts to reshape English culture. And they were saying, look, there is much to English culture than materialism, and for that you don't need to be an Orthodox Christian. And these people were dealing with things that were scientific, like the psychic research, that were humanities, and that they did not need to be Orthodox Christian ideas. Right, so I think I'll move to the second thing I wanted to mention. There is, again, not much literature on the history of science and religion in Catholic environments, and which is kind of the periphery here. And I'm just mentioning these two. One is just the second one is just a manifesto on how science and Catholic religion are compatible and how Catholic religion has promoted always science and so on. So it's kind of a manifesto. The first one is more interesting, but again, which are the topics? Galileo, Darwin, Big Bang. Give me a break. Sorry. I mean, I think there's more into science and into religion if you're going to talk about those things, unless the conflict thesis has succeeded in saying, well, we have to talk about science and religion only when there is potential conflict to say there is or there is not. Papal documents. So let's move to Italy, to the Vatican, let's move to Rome. And you know, there's the whole anti-modernist movement, the whole reaction against the loss of power of the Vatican States, the unification of Italy, Garibaldi, and all these things happening. And Pius X, no, that's Pius IX. I have this. Yeah, that's Pius IX, the Pope reigning for 40 years or something. There's, during his reign, the First Vatican Council, which British and Protestants of all sorts laughed a lot at for this declaration of the dogma of the papal infallibility and the movements against modernity. I'm going to just quote a bit from these documents to show you what's the rhetoric in a number of things that at times we identify as the same, that people talk about science and religion identify as the same, and I wonder if they are the same. I just say I wonder, meaning I don't think they're the same, which is words like reason, knowledge, or science. Especially taking into account that when they use the word science, I mean, these documents are written, at least the official ones, in Latin, and the cultural tradition is that of Italian, French, and certainly German theology, so it's more the word Wissenschaft than the word science, right? So a broader notion. So let me quote from the Syllabus Aurorum. The Syllabus Aurorum was a papal document that put together, it's a cut and paste thing, something that we all know very well how to do these days with computers. So it's a cut and paste thing from different documents in a one-line thing of what things are errors, which things are mistakes. And among those things that a Catholic should not believe are the following. All the dogmas of the Christian religion are indiscriminately the object of natural science or philosophy, and human reason, enlightened solely in an historical way, is able by its own natural strength and principles to attain to the true science of even the most abstruse dogmas, provided only that such dogmas be proposed to reason itself as its object. So that is one of the things that a Catholic must abide, that science is not enough to... and by science, interestingly, by science here, it's meaning history. Because the great enemy here is Hegel. The great enemy here is the historization of everything, to say that, well, now we would say that everything in religion is a social construction, right? Another one, the decrees of the Apostolic See and of the Roman Congregation impede the true progress of science. So if you're a Catholic in the 19th century, you cannot say that science, that religion, the Catholic religion, is against science, right? You cannot say it, right? That's a dogma that's not a dogmatic document anyway, but that's what it was said. And another one, the method and principles by which the old scholastic doctors cultivated theology are no longer suitable to the demands of our times and to the progress of the sciences. Again, if you're a Catholic, you have to think that medieval philosophy has something to say. So one could say, and actually it is quite a reactionary thing, but still, that's not against science. That's part of the rhetoric I want to emphasize. And I insist, I'm talking about rhetoric, I'm not talking about what actually happened, what actually the consequences of that are, right? Let me quote from the first, and this is, yes, a dogmatic document in the First Vatican Council that was happening at the time that the Pope had to flee because Garibaldi was entering, no, not Garibaldi, but the troops were entering onto the Vatican. So the same Holy Mother Church holds and teaches that God, the beginning and end of all things, can be known with certitude by the natural light of human reason from created things. So again, and that is a dogma in the Catholic Church of 1870, not 1970, 1870, that from the natural you can get to the supernatural, right? I once asked a Dominican in Cambridge what he made of that, and he said, fair enough. What this text says is that it is actually possible to do that, not that it has actually happened, right? Not that actually someone has done that, which is, not the same. And another thing, but although faith is above reason, nevertheless, between faith and reason, no true dissension can ever exist, since the same God who reveals mysteries and infuses faith has bestowed on the human soul the light of reason. Moreover, God cannot deny himself, and so on. So, the idea, again, that reason is not against theology or faith, and that therefore faith is not against science, right? And I insist, when these documents are written, by science is meant mainly history, okay? Right, and then you have the last document I want to quote here, which is the famous document by the next Pope, the following Pope, Leo XIII, in which he makes it compulsory in all Catholic seminaries, that is, where priests are trained, to study Thomism as the philosophy. Right? Again, is that document related to science and religion or to science? Well, in a way it is, yes, for what happened afterwards, which was that all Catholic university became Thomists of a sort, right? No, I don't think Aquinas would recognize himself in what was happening there. But there's another element. It's a debate between different ways of understanding theology. It's a debate between different ways of understanding philosophy. And let me quote, because I think what relates to the sciences. When philosophy stood stainless in honor and wise in judgment, then, as facts and constant experience showed, the liberal arts flourished as never before or since. But neglected and almost blotted out, they lay prone, since philosophy began to lean to error and join hands with folly. Nor will the physical sciences themselves, which are now in such great repute, and by the renown of so many inventions drawn such a universal admiration to themselves, suffer detriment, but find very great assistance in the restoration of the ancient philosophy. Again, this rhetoric of, look, by implementing these ancient philosophies, we're not only not going against scientific development, but we're going for better and more scientific development. And from another paragraph, they well understood that nothing was of greater use to the philosopher than diligently to search into the mysteries of nature and to be earnest and constant in the study of physical things, like Thomas Aquinas, like Albertus Magnus, and all these things. So basically, it is how important it is, this way of understanding nature, in order to promote the search for understanding of nature. As I said, that was about rhetoric. Let's move nearby. Actually, that's very much the Basque country, not just Spain, but the Basque country during the Carlist wars. So, you know, Spain had a big civil war in the 19th century, in the 20th century, but it had many during the 19th century, especially three, about many things, right? And, well, as I said in the introduction, this country, I don't know if it's religious or not, but certainly it is clerical or anti-clerical. And part of that is that here in the Basque country, those who were going to war against modernity were mainly priests, right? So that's, or big chunk were priests. Where do I have these things? Here. An excessive anti-clericalism in the name of science did not always force religious environments to withdraw from science, but promoted an effort among some Catholics to show how compatible science was with their religion. The conflict thesis was paying off, that of enthroning science as necessary for secular salvation or salvation in the public sphere, which is another way to be saved, right? Here's the thesis of, the thesis of Stefan Paul. He did his thesis in Barcelona, now he's back in Colombia. And he talks about what the rhetoric was when thermodynamics came into Spain, and how the conservation of energy was used by both materialists and religious people in using the conservation of energy as, look, we don't need a God, or conservation of energy as, look, we need the wind-up clock God, like the Leibniz and Clark old discussion. But also, you have a huge, because of the liberal movement of using science, the catchword science, in a country where there had not been much science, must be said, as one of the tools, one of the targets, one of the tags of modernity and liberalism and liberal society and democracy and so on. You also have a movement starting in the 1870s of clerics, and that's why I insist, it's a very clerical country, not Catholics, but clerics saying, okay, we have to do science in our institutions, right? And models are like, you know, Jaume Bossitor, priest and chemist. And that's the kind of icons that appear again. So one can be a priest and a chemist. And I'm translating from the Spanish. Why should there not be among the clergy those who devote their time to the study and improvement on every science that make human knowledge? Would it not be a great testimony to see that scientific progress comes from clergymen, or at least, that clergymen are involved in it, who cannot see the respect and admiration that some clergymen are looked upon when they are regarded as first-rate scientists. Something similar happens to many of us historians of science when we give talks in scientific environments and you start saying, I did physics, right? Oh, then you have prestige. I'm a historian sociologist. Okay, what is he going to say, right? So this idea of even now in the humanities, you have to prove that you know some science by crediting. So the same argument goes here. If we want religion to regain some prestige, we need clerics that are at the same time scientists. And that's, was it the last? Yeah, and that's the last slide, that's up in Bilbao. And that's what the Jesuits who, because this is a very clerical country, were expelled a number of times during the 19th century, I think it's 3 or 4 times. When they came back towards the end of the 19th century, one of the many comebacks, that was part of the agenda. Okay, the liberal world has won. We have to be part of it. And therefore, we create universities, we create schools in which science is a big thing. Like from Deusto, like the observatory there in the south of Tarragona, and the creation of institutions that were for science. So, in a way, to sum up the thing I've already said, right? So far from the internal logic of the conflict thesis, the secularist program of using science for ideological agendas did not necessarily create enemies for science among European Christians. Science became a catchword for religious agendas as well, irrespective of the real impact this rhetoric had on the development of the sciences. Science became a necessary ally on all sides of the fence. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for a lovely talk. I'm wondering if, does it strike you as a little bit odd when the papal edicts that get released from the 1860s onwards are talking about a vision of science that only really occurred in the 18th century to place reason above faith, when in the 19th century no one talks about reason anymore. Reason leads you into things like revolution and cutting off monarchs' heads. Yeah, they talk much more about the will to knowledge, and particularly if you're talking about a Hegelian history.
Yeah.
Yeah, with that, those themes come out more. So, do you think that you know, in some way, the clerical mindset is fighting the shadows in their own heads?
If, I mean, the answer is if we think of it, as I try to do today, in terms of science religion, yes, they are. The thing is, they're not. Right? That's why if one tries to say, look, how backwards they were because they were not fighting or contributing to science the way they should have, well, because that was not their agenda. I mean, I tried to read them from that point of view, but as I said and emphasized, you know, science was mainly history or science was mainly philosophies. So yeah, they're fighting against many post-Kantian and Hegelian philosophies, but they don't care about physics or physiology or these things when they're writing these documents, right? That's why I was saying this is I share this thing, this is a science religion, taking into account that like Steve Shapin in the introduction of the book, there's no such thing as science, necessarily science and religion, yeah.
Thanks for the talk, because I think you give us a very interesting area where we can explore the concept of promise. Mm-hmm. So when you were talking, I was thinking you focus mainly on the conflict thesis. And so I was thinking science and religion actually are so similar when you think through your concept, through promise. Through promise, because both of them make huge promises. I mean, if you think about Catholics and Orthodox, they have a very basic promise that after death, you are going to reach the perfect world. If you think about science, I think that science is trying, and technology, are trying to succeed this within this life. Like, mm-hmm. They both promise that
it's a secularization of redemption, yeah.
So I was thinking, I mean, it's not a question, it's just a thought that promise here has a very interesting job to do. And instead of looking more on what is different between science and religion, to see how they are very similar. And just one comment, I do have a problem with this concept of European periphery.
Oh, okay.
Maybe it's not the place to discuss it, but when you say European periphery, who are you including there? Because let's say you put Germans and Greeks or Italians together, I don't think that they are going to agree that they belong to the same European periphery.
Actually, just to start with the last thing, every 2 years there's the the workshop.
Good.
Now this year it's in Lisbon in September before the European one. And yeah, that's part of what do we mean by periphery and so on. And also what do we mean about European periphery, because there's a lot of Latin Americans now in the group, right? But I agree with you. Perhaps I fell into the trap of starting with a conflict thesis in trying to argue that one cannot talk about conflict thesis without much nuances and so on. And part of the way I see the rhetoric of science, yes, I agree with you, it's the secularization of lots of Christian notions. We had this morning the paper by Javier. So when at the apocalypse meaning the change is natural, secularized. So it's not a change in the afterlife, but it's a change here, and therefore we need the constant change here, right? So to the extent that at times when they ask me to talk about these things of science and religion, I use an expression that I didn't use today, because at times I like the expression of science as religion, right? Because it shares in the rhetoric and in the expectations of society a lot that religions show. But then this other element on whether there is such thing as religion, because I don't think an Orthodox Catholic and a Muslim whatever will have much in common, or a Hindu from whatever, or a Buddhist, or a guy from the Indian tribes in all Native Americans, whatever. But okay, it's a long thing here.
I'm aware that we're going to go now for lunch, but we do have 2 more questions. I'm going to ask to keep your questions fairly short.
Sure, I'll try. I'll try because I'm the boss, yeah.
Okay, before I connect what I wanted to say to the discussion now, because I'm coming from a religion that gives much less promises. So it's not so clear in Judaism whether there is afterlife. It's something under discussion, discussion not so much, but under contest. It's doubted.
Yeah. But sorry, if I may, that's why I think I said at some stage that some of the notions that Europeans attribute to the concept of religion are Christian concepts.
Right? The redemption, of course. But what is connected, of course, between the science and religion is the fact that they gives you some kind of a worldview from which to understand the things, or all the world around you. And here I think that there is much more to the conflict thesis, not regarding so much Galileo, but look at I think on this regarding what you read from the Italians from the from the church in the 19th century, is what we have to do with the Enlightenment, because at the end all these texts is totally anti-Enlightenment, and for the Enlightenment, science is a big promise, not so much in the sense of technological prosperity.
It's knowledge.
But yes, but for knowledge. And as I read what you claimed, there was some kind of the claim that you cannot really look yourself to the knowledge. There are some places that you need to stop, and that's what the church say. You have to be Thomist. You have to go after Thomism in the 19th century, and to be Thomism in the 19th century, it's anti-science. So whatever you put it.
I mean, because my time period is not the 18th or 17th century, but I have read quite a bit. There's Peter Harrison's book, which I find fascinating. And one of the answers to that, I'm not saying it's the answer to that, is that the Enlightenment has a lot of the rhetoric of the goddess reason. But at the same time, if you look at Kant, is stop looking at the Ding an sich. So we have no access to reality anymore, but just to the phenomena. So there's this tension also in the philosophical movements of the Enlightenment, that there's a lot of talk of now with reason we get everything, but hang on a second, a reason that doesn't give us the Ding an sich anymore. So, and there comes the conflict with theological perspectives, of course, because it goes beyond just the pure phenomena. It wants to go to the Ding an sich. But yeah, that's a long debate, yeah.
So from the little I look into the British case, I had the impression that the place in which the conflict actually is crude is at the pedagogical level, right? So you have Playfair reviewing Laplace Mécanique Céleste and saying, look, it's terrible. We had Newton, and now the French are doing the hot stuff, right? And then Pico tried to import in Cambridge analysis, analytical methods. And then I remember Newman in his book, right, saying clearly, look, religion and theology has the same dignity as science to be
in the university.
In the universities,
yes.
Right? So at that level, it seems that there is a real conflict, right?
Well, actually, if you quote Newman on that, and we finish, Newman saying it has the same level at the university, and that's what he wants in UCD, and he's totally he's totally angry when they create the university and there's no department for physics. And he claims there should be a department for physics precisely because they are at the same level. But the Irish bishops thought otherwise, right? Anyway, I should finish here because we're 5 minutes late. Lunch is where we had things, and we're convening back again. Remember, at 2, not 2:30, but at 2, right?